Bom dia. That's about the limit of my Portuguese. Pero hablo español. So if you like to speak, we can speak in Portuñol. It's another option. So thank you very much, Alex, for that. For that introduction. I will pass on your regards to my wife, who would have very much liked to have been here. I'm not representing my wife here today, and I'm not, technically speaking, representing the International Labour Organization, but I did want to discuss with you today some aspects of the ILO's thinking on the future of work, and in particular the role of lifelong learning in that context. So again, thank you very much for the invitation. I'd like to also thank Bradesco Seguros for enabling this very important meeting to take place. And I'd also like to thank Elisa and her team for all of the logistics that have made it possible for us to be here. I'm going to talk about a number of different things. Alex told me that I have 3 or 4 hours to discuss, so I'm not, I hope that that's okay with you, Alex. But I'd like to give you an overview of some developments at the ILO regarding the future of work, and leading towards a few comments on what we call the multi-stage life, on the role of lifelong learning in that, and some of the policy building blocks for what we call a human-centered approach to longer working lives. And I hope that that will be of interest to you. I could say, by the way, simply, I agree with Alessia, and then sit down, because I do agree with you. My presentation intended to be a little broader on some of the policy issues that we need to think about. It's okay? Okay. I'm not sure which button I pressed, but it seemed like it was the right one. Okay, so just a few words about the International Labour Organization, for those of you who may not be familiar with it. The ILO is a member or a part of the family of organizations of the United Nations, but it's different. It's different in a number of very important aspects, in particular the fact that it is not just an intergovernmental organization, but it is what we call a tripartite organization, meaning its governance is by member states, by trade union organizations, and by employers' organizations. So these three partners make up the governance of the institution, and the institution, the ILO, responds to the needs of these three constituents, as we call them, and that is of course very important. The ILO is this year celebrating its centenary. It was established in 1919 and is the only remaining organization that came out of the Paris Peace Treaty of 1919, which brought a final end to the horrors of the First World War. And the ILO has survived a whole century, survived the Cold War, survived a number of different tragedies that, of course, have befallen the world, of course, including the Second World War, and still remains today the forum for the discussion, the global debate over work and the world of work. The theme of the future of work was determined as the central theme of the centenary year, but the centenary year, as it were, began 2 or 3 years ago with a series of national tripartite debates. It led to which led to the establishment of a global commission on the future of work, which was chaired by the President of South Africa and the Prime Minister of Sweden. It produced a report, which I have a copy of. It produced a report on the Work for a Brighter Future from the Global Commission on the future of work. And this led to the centenary conference of the International Labour Conference in June this year, when, after very difficult negotiations, a centenary declaration was agreed upon with regards to the future of work and the ILO's role in the future, its future role in terms of its mandate. A few things, first of all, then. Nope. A few things, first of all, about the dimensions of the employment challenge that the world is facing. From the ILO's research and projections, 344 million jobs need to be created by the year 2030. Already we have 190 million people currently unemployed across the globe, and 300 million people working in extreme poverty, what we call the working poor. 2 billion people work in what we call the informal economy. But it's not only a question of the numbers, there are quantitative challenges, qualitative challenges as well. 2.78 million people per year die from work-related accidents and illnesses. So we have a major occupational safety and health challenge. But also inequalities in the world of work. The wage growth between 2016 to 17 declined from 2.4% to 1.8%. We are, of course, very well aware of the fact that 20% pay gap between men and women on average, and of course in some sectors this imbalance is much greater. And we should also be aware of the fact that the richest 1% of the global receive 27% of income growth, and the poorest 50% receive only 12% between 1980 and 2016. So before we even get to what is the nature of work in the future, we have to be thinking about the quantities of work that will need to be, or employment that will need to be created to enable people to survive. Following a little bit on what Alessia was saying about forces that are transforming the world of work, and I'm not going to repeat everything that she has said very eloquently, but we're looking at 4 main forces: the technological advance, and indeed Alessia spoke about about automation. But also, from the ILO's perspective, there is a increasing risk of what we call the atomization of work. That work is becoming atomized. More and more people are working individually. whether they be working at home, whether they be working in small units. The notion of work being a place that a lot of people go to work. This is no longer necessarily the case, and of course, this is the new technology is enabling this atomization of work to take place. Many of you may be familiar with the debates around what we call the platform economy, the gig economy, the Ubers and the other platforms that are available. These kinds of working arrangements are, of course, enabled by technology, and very often not sufficiently directed by people. Secondly, is of course the climate change issue, the environmental issue, greening of the greening of economies. Thirdly, the demographics. Again, I'm not going to discuss here the question of demographics. I think you're all very familiar with the demographical challenges. On the one hand, of course, younger populations in many countries, and in other countries, populations which are becoming much older. And of course, the impact of globalization, the globalization which has enabled, again, new forms of work, value change, outsourcing, offshoring, and so on and so forth. The point is being made, of course, here is that these factors, which are, of course, having a dramatic impact on the world of work, these factors, on the one hand, are creating jobs, but at the same time destroying jobs. And we have to look to see how we can ensure that the jobs are indeed being created at a faster rate than they are being destroyed. No. Oh. Help. Sorry? No. There we go. No. That's okay. I'm not trainable. Beyond training. So the Global Commission that I spoke about before, proposed what is called a human-centered agenda with 3 pillars of action. I want to discuss these briefly. The increase of investment in people's capabilities, and that I think is the key to the discussion that we're having these 2 days. Increased investment in the institutions of work, and increased investment in decent and sustainable work. And I want to discuss these in a little bit more detail a bit later on, but one of the key notions that came out of the Commission's work with regard to lifelong learning for all was the notion of a universal entitlement to lifelong learning. That the lifelong learning, which I think has had a mixed course over the past several decades. The Commission came behind the idea of having a universal entitlement to lifelong learning. Second key area that the Commission proposed was the need to support people through transitions, and again I'd like to talk a little bit more about that in a few minutes. proposed a transformative agenda for gender equality, of course, focusing on strengthening women's voice and leadership, eliminating violence and harassment at work, equal pay for work of equal value, and a number of other key elements, and strengthening social protection, providing a social protection floor based on the principle of solidarity and the sharing of risks throughout the life cycle. Another area of concern to the Commission was the proposal to establish what they called a universal labour guarantee. A universal labour guarantee is the notion of a minimum agreed standards of working conditions based on fundamental working rights, fundamental workers' rights, adequate living wage, healthy working environment, working hours, and so on and so forth. But also the notion of the need to expand what is called time sovereignty, meaning quite simply the control that people have over the time that they work, and the need. And this, of course, particularly relates to the increasing needs of the care economy and of populations requiring care, and the need for people to be able to balance their working lives and their care lives at the same time. The revitalization of collective representation. It is no secret that trade unions are losing members globally. It's also a factor that employers' organizations are not growing as they would like. It is difficult to see how, in a future world based on the values that I've been presenting, this can be achieved without a revitalization of the social contract between workers, employers, and governments. And last but certainly not least, the issue of technology and the need to control the development of technology rather than the technology to lead us. Nope. Okay. And the third area of concern to the Commission is the increased investment in decent and sustainable work, particularly in different forms of employment, providing also different shifting incentives towards business and economic models. Again, a very interesting topic, but not one that I'm going to discuss today. Who is responsible? Who is responsible for enabling these changes to take place? Again, first of all, through the reinvigoration of the social contract. The ILO has, of course, a number of very key responsibilities, but also the responsibilities of the multilateral system as a whole, the multilateral organizations, whether they be from within the United Nations family, Bretton Woods institutions, the WTO, and so on and so forth, which I think you may be aware that the multilateral system is coming under attack from a number of different sources and from different areas, which of course is not very helpful at all. All of this preparatory work led to the adoption in June this year of the Centenary Declaration for the Future of Work. It was adopted on the 21st of June as a result of day and night negotiations between the different partners, the tripartite constituents of the ILO, the workers, the employers, and the governments. And the Centenary Declaration sets forth a way forward for both for the ILO and I think for the world at large. It is a declaration which is not legally binding, but nevertheless it is a declaration that has been adopted unanimously by all member states of the ILO, who will of course need to report to the International Labour Organization on the progress that they have made. I'd like to develop just a little bit in the few minutes that are remaining. I'd like to develop just a little bit the discussion of what we're calling a three-stage life, or the transition from a three-stage life to a multi-stage life. Of course, I think everybody in this room is very much aware of the fact that the world of work is changing very rapidly, and we are moving away from this three-stage model to what we call a multi-stage life. The three-stage model thinks about life in terms of education, work, and retirement. But the reality of life, of course, is changing for certainly for millions and millions of people. It includes a number of different aspects. It includes education, it includes self-employment, it includes training, retirement, volunteering, flexible work, and so on and so forth. So these different, and as people move between one type of work, one type of occupation to another, they, of course, they're making transitions which need support. And I think this is the point where the lifelong learning has a very important role to enable people, to help people to make these transitions. But what are the challenges? What are the challenges? First of all, in terms of lifelong education, I think Alessia mentioned a number of elements. I would argue that education and training systems are in many cases today not really fit for encouraging and supporting the multiple transitions that I mentioned already. If the investments in lifelong learning are very low, we're talking about perhaps 1%, not more than 1% of total public expenditure available for adult education. And as we know, and has been mentioned, there's extremely low participation of various vulnerable groups, including the elderly. And certainly one of the reasons for the lack of educational opportunities for the elderly is because of prejudice and lack of support, and also because of the notion of, well, is it really worth investing money, scarce public funding, is it really worth investing in people who are in any way at the end of their working lives. Also, I think I'd like to add another point, that for many adults and elderly people, the classroom is not necessarily the best or the most attractive kind of environment. But the issue of the challenges are not only related to lifelong learning, instead, but also in terms of the social protection. Social security systems are very largely based on the old model of the three-stage life cycle. Transition periods bringing a high cost, a high risk of no benefits coverage at all, ensuring sustainability to support an increasing number and a wider diversity of transitions is going to certainly be a very big challenge. And in terms of the employment of older workers, there are, of course, the negative perceptions about older persons which drive many people's attitudes. Workplaces themselves and work arrangements are insufficiently supportive of diversified lifestyles. Of course, labour market policies in most countries tend to focus with some understanding on the needs of youth, but this often is a trade-off in which older workers suffer. For example, even though we know that enterprises created by people above the age of 50 have a much higher survival rate than those created by younger people, entrepreneurship training globally is mainly offered to young people. Now, I'm not saying that we stop investing in young people, far from it, but nevertheless, I think we should be looking for a more balanced perspective. And last but not least, here are, in my view, some of the policy building blocks necessary for a human-centered approach to longer working lives. Lifelong learning is important, it's key, but it's not the only thing. And we need to think a little bit broader. We need to think in terms of what we call the skills ecosystem, social protection, and also the how to encourage decent work for older workers. So a skills ecosystem that provides more and better opportunities for people to participate in training and education activities throughout their lifetime according to their needs and aspirations. In addition, individuals, enterprises and governments need to share responsibility for lifelong learning. Extended and new financial incentives for workers, enterprises and institutions alike, if smartly designed, can help steer the provision of training to reach different groups and sectors where they are most needed. But also in terms of social protection, a social protection system that closes existing coverage gaps, including for people in the informal economy, in rural areas and the self-employed and new forms of employment, and systems that overcome the obstacles to continued coverage, combining enhanced social insurance mechanisms with stronger tax finance provisions will ensure universal coverage throughout the life course. And in terms of decent work, we need decent work for older workers through improved active labour market policies and public employment services. We need changed perceptions by employers and enterprises towards older workers and people changing jobs, and we need to use new technologies and time-related measures to support active aging. So there's a big menu of things that need to be done, and we only have until the end of tomorrow to fix all this. So we better start. We better start work. And I better learn how to operate this machine. Thank you.